Thank you, Brad and Dave. Thank you so much for that. Boo! Yes, it's Halloween this week. It is Halloween this week. And so that occasion meets our moment as people who feel especially at risk, as people who love those who are especially at risk. This is a dangerous time in our country. Speaking with someone the other day and talking about how time changes perspective, and we thought it was the end of the world back in 2004. I remember that was my first year here. And I always remark about that first year because, again, it was the first time that I was pastor of a church where the majority of folk were white. And so it was a different culture. And one of the things that kind of baffled me when I first arrived, and that first fall, it was an election year. And I heard several of the members saying to me, "Oh, I cannot stand Thanksgiving." I'm like, "What? What? That's one of my favorite holidays, all the good foods." No, Madison, you don't understand. I've got to go home to my family. Because our church admittedly draws rather progressive liberal folk, but not all of your families are quite that way. Families are mixed in many different directions. However, that's relatively less true among black families. Black families have voted 90% for Democrats ever since the Civil Rights Movement. Before the Civil Rights Movement, blacks were all voting Republican. Abraham Lincoln, maybe. And maybe the fact that in the South, where 90% of black folks lived, the Democratic Party would not allow black folks to join, but the Republican Party did. And so many of my ancestors, my grandfather, great-grandfather, were Republicans, and my uncle, a holdout, he was a Republican right through the 80s. But he finally saw the light. But no, so we didn't have that same kind of tension around the holidays because the majority of people saw things politically. All of us were striving to overcome racism and civil rights, so that wasn't so much a political problem. But I came to understand that through you that this can be a difficult and challenging time. And so I just wanted to share with us a word from our tradition, a word that I feel gives us hope, a word that I feel strengthens us against the fear that creeps in, be it the fear not being able to see, or the fear of having to engage with those we love who think very differently, and how do we maintain those relationships. Now, the first letter of Peter, as we acknowledged, probably wasn't written by the Apostle Peter, but it's still very valuable to us because it's part of our Christian tradition. And the Christian community that produced it is as Christian as any other. And so we need to understand how they thought and how they responded to very scary times. You see, this letter was probably written under severe persecution of Christians. Rome was not a Christian nation until the 4th century. And prior to that, Christianity was persecuted, prosecuted, literally prosecuted. It was a crime to be a Christian if you failed to acknowledge the divinity of the emperor. Not only did you have to pay taxes, but you had to perform a ritual of obedience. Let me say it again. Not only did you have to pay taxes, but you had to perform a ritual of obedience. And in the Roman Empire, that simply meant you had to go to the cathedral. See, the first cathedrals were the temples of Rome. And then they converted them to Christian temples later. So you would go to the temple, and the cult of the emperor, the high priest in that place, would witness you burning some incense and saying, "Caesar is Lord." That was your act of obedience and acknowledgement that the Caesar was divine and that the Caesar was the Lord of your life. And so when Christianity emerged and the Christian motto was proclaimed by every proper Christian, what was their cry? Jesus is Lord. That was treason. That was defiance. And it was punishable by torture and death. And the Christian community was a very small community. Remember, it was just a handful of folk in the Galilean desert. And so they could not resist physically. They could not fight back against the Roman Empire. And if they were going to be drawn into courts and charged with treason or unfaithfulness or whatever the charge was, they could not resist. And so we have to understand the letter of Peter was produced by a very small Christian community that was surrounded by people who thought very differently than they did. They were surrounded by people who worshiped very differently than they did. And they were surrounded by people who were armed to the teeth. And they did not possess guns, or they did not possess, anachronistic. They did not possess weapons. And so they started to communicate with each other in the fashion that I would say you might want to call a survival guide for the lonely Christian. How to survive. Now, we're proud of all the resistance movements. We're proud of all the liberation movements. And they are the movements that ultimately overturn the status quo and bring about a new opportunity for all people. But let us not forget that some people were just trying to survive. And so when we went on our civil rights pilgrimage last month, we went to Montgomery and we went to Birmingham. We saw the places of resistance, but we also went to Tuskegee. And not everyone understands that in the early days of the 20th century, there was quite a political split in the black community. It got resolved one way, but there was a big split between W.B. Du Bois, who was a liberationist, and the folks down at Tuskegee, Booker T. Washington, who were considered accommodationists. And both traditions are part of the black tradition, and we're proud to claim them both, but we claim them with open eyes, that there was this division. My wife, Gail, her mother and father went to Tuskegee because that was the only opportunity for education to them. My grandfather wanted to go to Tuskegee. My aunt did go to Tuskegee. And so I'm just saying that there are communities which, under tremendous pressure and oppression, develop strategies of survival. How can we make the best out of a bad situation? And sometimes making the best out of a bad situation means accommodating your oppressors, behaving in ways that will not antagonize them, quite frankly. And so you're encouraged to say, yes, sir, massa. You're encouraged to respond when they call you boy and you're a grown man. You're encouraged to behave in a way that comports with their expectations of who you are, even though you know that you are more than they think of you. Emmett Till. How many of you know the story of Emmett Till? A young black boy, 13, 14 years old, living in Chicago, grew up in Chicago in the 1950s, was going down south to visit family. And his mother gave him the talk about how to behave, how to stay out of trouble. But you know how teenagers are, he didn't get the lesson very well. And because he behaved normally as a teenager might, or normally as a person might, and there are uncertainties about the actual story, but it was simply not in character for who that culture of the segregated Jim Crow South thought he was and how he should behave. And for even looking at this white woman, he was beaten, drowned, brutalized, killed. And his mother, when she received the body in all of its distorted reality, insisted on an open casket so that the world could see how ugly Jim Crow was. But I say all this simply to remind us that people in our midst today are simply trying to survive and to keep their head down and to behave in ways that do not provoke those with the power over their lives. So I often tell you to do your homework. The letter of Peter is not very long. You can read it in less than 10 minutes probably. But you will find there some of those traditions of the early Roman Empire that were universal, that were patriarchal, that were misogynistic. You will find those famous phrases, wives, obey your husbands, slaves, obey your masters. And that leads into the passage that we are reading today. Can I have it on my screen here? Now, who will harm you if you are eager to do what is good? But even if you do suffer for doing what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear what they fear. Do not be intimidated, but in your hearts sanctify Christ as Lord. Always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and a smile, and respect. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if suffering should be God's will, than to suffer for doing evil. So this is a manual for survival. And so as we live now in our present moment of fear and danger, I want to encourage you, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Yes, this is Halloween, and Halloween is a time of scariness. You know, Halloween was pagan ritual that got culturally appropriated by the Christian church. It's just like we did with Christmas, just like we did with Easter. And so the rituals of our pagan ancestors, y'all's pagan ancestors, the Celts. Brian had other traditions. So they thought that this was the new year. I woke up this morning, it was still dark. And so as winter starts to approach, they thought this was a new year. And so they believed that at the end of one year and the beginning of the next was this thin place in our existence. And those who had died the year before had this little window before the year turned that they could come back and visit their family and visit their homes, and they would then see those who were responsible for why they were dead, and they would cause them trouble. And so Halloween emerged from that kind of pagan festival, and we've converted it into our All Saints' Day, Dia de los Muertos, opportunities to honor the dead rather than to be afraid of them. So we have these monsters that we put on the mask and we make ourselves up as monsters, but there's a deeper psychological tradition behind that. You see, monsters are mirrors of societal fears rather than sources of real danger. So when Josh dresses up as Freddy Krueger, he realizes that Freddy really isn't that bad a guy because Freddy's me. We dress up as these monsters, but we recognize that the monsters are not real, that once I take my mask off, it's gone. So Halloween is a time when we face our fears as a mode and means of overcoming them. Halloween is a time to face our monsters and make fun of them, stick our tongues out at them as a means of undermining their power. And so that's why sometimes when situations are horrible and hard, that what we really need to do is simply stick our tongue out, laugh at them. So it was on this night that the souls of those who had died could return to haunt those who had killed them in the places where they had died. And another tradition behind wearing masks is that we wear these masks so that those who are looking for us, the dead souls, won't recognize us. We're hiding from them. And so I don't know, what are you going to dress up to be this Halloween? How will you hide your face? Let's see, what's the most popular costume? Oh, it's a monster. Ooh, I'm so scared. But the monsters are not real. They're not real. That's the point. They dress up. Maybe we should dress up. Maybe we should dress up as due process and face those monsters. The scripture asks the question, who will harm you if you are eager to do what is good? We know exactly who will harm us for just trying to do good. We know exactly who will jail us for being an accompanying person to those who are reporting to the immigration office, which they are required to do to be in compliance with the law, and then snatched away. And they will arrest you just for trying to be a witness to that crime. But ultimately, our survival manual reminds us, do not fear. Yes, it's a hard situation to survive. Yes, they have all the weapons and the power, but do not fear, and most of all, do not capitulate in your heart. Do not capitulate in your heart. They are not gods. Only God is God. Stay focused on the faith that has propelled us to this moment in our lives, that Jesus is the way. And we are going to stay on that path. We're going to stay on that journey come what may. We will not be afraid. We will not capitulate. We will not back down. In the end, he encourages them, always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you. In other words, be ready to explain to someone why you're standing with that undocumented person. Be ready to explain to someone why you're standing with that lesbian person, why you're standing with that trans person, why you are standing in solidarity with those who are oppressed, rejected, denied. Be ready to say, I do this because I serve the God of love. And the God of love causes me to be in every place where people are hurting, causes me to be in every place where monsters are trying to destroy the lives of innocent children. My faith requires that I be here, but do it with a smile, so as not to provoke those who would oppress us. But we know they may still, because they have the power. But when he says, do not fear what they fear, do not fear death as the ultimate reality of life. Because the way we live and the way we die is so much more valuable than the number of years that we live. That's all we've got. So don't capitulate in your heart, because for them, the cruelty is the point, and fear is their weapon. So if we do not fear, then no weapon shall be formed against us, and it shall not prevail, but we shall overcome. Amen.